Hello, and welcome to another episode of Solipsist Watched. I'm your host, the Social Solipsist, and this week I watched Legend from 2015. This is a movie that has crossed my radar every now and then. Mostly either somebody makes mention of it and a particular performance in it, or I see a clip from it. And there's been enough now that I was just like, this is probably not going to be too awful. Let me check it out, which is not a great place to start. But I was somewhat hopeful. And honestly, going through most of this film, I thought I was watching something pretty decent. It's really not to make it too transparent right up front, but it's really doing a lot right and ending up being a lot less than the sum of its parts. And it's only really in retrospect, after having watched the entire film and processed it as a whole, that it starts to stand out where the significant issues really lie. At its core, this is very reminiscent of a slightly older style of crime film, of which we've talked about many in this ongoing series of mine. And it's impossible not to compare this to a few of them, but in particular Goodfellas, which I think I've expressed before, but to reiterate, I think is a very well-made film, but I also have more problems with than most people. That said, through most of the film, I would have put this not quite on par with Goodfellas, but, reaching for it in a way that didn't feel entirely just like it was trying to copy or something like that. But it's really after the fact, having seen it to completion, that some of the greater issues are really more apparent. Framework-wise, it's a very similar kind of thing. A multifaceted story following multiple characters and the relationships that they have under the circumstances in which they are living and conducting their business and their crimes. And that all sets up for a pretty reasonably compelling story. It is making a meaningful attempt to show the multifaceted nature of these things, that the main characters are not, unaware. They are not unaware of their criminality. They are not necessarily even happy with the criminal nature of their enterprise, but they are, having to meet their abilities and their opportunities with the realities of the world they live in. And that sets up a bunch of interesting premises that the movie starts to explore, but doesn't entirely conclude. I'm going to talk about that a little bit towards the end, and I'll signpost that because I'm not going to spoil it directly, but I'm going to talk about a lot of the sort of general beats of the story and why that sort of starts to cause it to fall apart pretty substantially. Production-wise and acting and casting, this is a pretty good production. The casting is interesting, and actually that's probably one of the most notable things about the film, is that we have Tom Hardy playing both lead characters. Now, there's a lot to unpack there as to if that's a good idea or not, or how disruptive it can be, or something like that, or even what it might say narratively about what you might expect out of the film. I don't believe this film actually says at any point in its running that it's based on real people, but it is. It is based on the actual Cray brothers, who were in the underground of London, in the East End in the, I think 40s through the sort of 60s and 70s. And so this is based on a real thing, but there is a little element of it, having not known that going into it, that you go, on certain occasions you go, wait a minute, are these actually two separate people, or is this like an unreliable narrator thing where actually it's one person telling two perspectives or something like that? And maybe it's just my cinema brain being a little too cooked on that kind of thing, to be worried about those things. But that struck me once or twice. I mostly dismissed it, and spoiler, non-spoiler, they are two different people. But it's just a little bit inherently weird, especially as you start. That said, as it goes on, Tom Hardy's performances are very good under the circumstances. He does play two very distinct characters, both in their personalities, their mannerisms, and their appearances. So there's never really any question, once you get past the sort of meta thinking of it, that these are two different people. It's actually, I will say, quite impressive, the sometimes subtle distinctions that are made between the characters. Often they are dressed up very similarly, but they, whether it's the hair, the shape of their face, I get this. I think that for one of the characters, he has prosthetics in his mouth, and a couple of other things that he does to affect both the shape of his face and the way he speaks. He's a very talented actor, but I will say, I like him as an actor. I think his performance dramatically depends on the movie that he's been cast in. Not all of his performances are fantastic, but I think he's talented. He really carries the majority of the film. The rest of the castings are good, and they serve their purposes admirably as needed, but the direction is ultimately not just not good enough. The direction and the writing is just not good enough to really make anyone stand out really substantially. I believe it's Emily Browning plays the love interest, and she does a very admirable job, but she's kind of not a very deep character. She's not written particularly fascinatingly, and even though she narrates a substantial part of the film, you don't really get that attached, or I didn't get that attached to her. Like, she was really there mostly as sort of a plot element more so than a real person, and that's really to the detriment of the movie as a whole. Especially when you have something like Goodfellas, where it can be hard to remember just in the chaos of that movie just how many of those characters are actually are memorable and meaningfully fleshed out in their character, even if they're only on screen for a few minutes. The details that are put into the performances and everything else about them can make them stick with you for a much longer period of time. There's a bunch of other smaller castings from some notable actors who I think all do fine jobs, but all of them, even Tom Hardy doing a pretty darn good performance on this script and in this production, are just not gonna be that memorable. I'm not gonna remember this movie. I'm sorry, that's just the reality of it. Part of that just being, that's just me. I forget a lot of the things I watch. That's half the reason I do this show. But part of it is just this isn't a memorable film. Goodfellas, for all my qualms with it, is an extremely memorable film. But this just isn't. The most memorable things will be a handful of individual scenes that many of which I'd already seen before I actually watched the film. So you've got a pretty good cast with doing some, largely mediocre or largely acceptable performances with mediocre script and a general tone that doesn't get you super engaged with the lives and individual behaviors of the various characters. Plot-wise, it does set up a lot to talk about, and it starts to explore a whole bunch of things, but doesn't really. This is something that I think it has in some ways in common with Goodfellas, at least in the former part. Goodfellas is constantly exploring a whole bunch of different aspects of the lives being lived, all at the same time, it does flesh them out very well, even if they're not always satisfyingly done so. This really doesn't flesh them all out all that much, and is more there to tell a certain type of story, and show the beats that it needs to show. The individual scenes, again, similar to Goodfellas, individual scenes are independently interesting, but when they are strung together, they don't always make for the most compelling overarching narrative. This is one of my bigger gripes about Goodfellas, as I've mentioned before, as I've mentioned in previous videos. I don't like the structural nature of Goodfellas all that much. I think it's a bit too many things all at once. But at least all of those scenes, even if they don't tie directly into the overarching narrative, they are still compelling on their own, and they still inform in some tertiary way the kind of attitude and behaviors that the characters are sort of growing into over time. This movie tries to do the same, doesn't really do that convincingly, ends up with a lot of scenes that kind of don't end up matching what the next scene is going to look like, what the character's behavior in the next scene is going to be, etc., etc. I'll get back into the direct issues of the plot towards the end. Like I said, the rest of the production, I think, is mostly fine. Cinematically, there are some actually very nice shots. Most of the rest are just sort of okay, fine, acceptable, not like wowing me, but they're very competently done. Music and sound and mixing, I think, is done, again, competently. It's not sticking out to me, but it's not necessarily, doesn't necessarily need to. It is, I think, a little bit of a missed opportunity. Again, it's sort of unfair to keep comparing it to the classics of mafia cinema, but like Goodfellas has some makes really clear and distinctive use of its music and stuff for storytelling purposes. The only case for that in this film is two very on the nose live musical numbers that happen in the scenes that they exist in themselves. The rest of it just sort of fades by, and those two scenes are so the music selections there are so on the nose. They're just like, you're just telling me what to think for this scene. I was already thinking it, but you're trying to tell me again. The rest of the production, because this is, again, a period piece, I think it does pretty well. I don't have the greatest sense of the styles of the time in London. Really don't know. I think that some of the stuff is done well enough to be appreciated. Certain the styles of the glasses and the suits and the cars and the look of some of the architecture and things like that all looks period appropriate to me at a glance. I don't really have the detail to really know. But they make enough of an effort that it's appreciated. As a side note, there are a couple of weird missing edits that I think were just, I think they were just missed. Where there's just inconsistencies in shot-to-shot editing from time to time. One of them is really glaring. And I'll just say it involves candy. And if you've seen this film or you end up watching it, not that I'm particularly recommending it, but it just really threw me. And I was like trying to concoct a scenario that explained what I had just watched, and I could not figure it out. So I'm pretty sure there's just some sloppy editing in this movie. This was made for not that much money. It was like $25 million allegedly. So, doing pretty all right under the circumstances. Hard to compare it fairly to other things of a greater budget, especially when it's got some nice set pieces. The interiors of some of the locations are really nicely done, but it's apparent that the budget is a limitation there. There aren't a lot of different locations. It's not the visual spectacle is not really wowing a lot of the time. And while the sets that they do have that are particularly, shiny and pretty, are used to good effect. They're more set pieces than they are locations. They don't feel like they have a lot of life to them. They're more of an idea of a place than a real place. The only way I can explain that better is just to say, like, you compare the famous scene from Goodfellas, where they walk in through the back into the bottom of this, in through the kitchen and stuff like that, and into the main hall, and it's this smoky room full of people. It feels very lived in. And by comparison, while this movie has a scene of, a comparable scene of this big spectacular club that they're in, it feels like a set. It doesn't feel lived in. It feels believable, but not lived in. It's a little bit too polished. It's a little bit too clean. It's a little bit, everybody's a little bit too actory. Actually, that does remind me of one other weird thing with an extra that I'm just going to point out, because it struck me as so weird, and I'm not going to go bother looking. I just want to point it out, though. There's a scene very near the end where one of Tom Hardy's characters pushes past an extra, and she's holding a drink, and she spills it a bit. And it's just a funny thing to me, because I don't know if she didn't expect him to push her, or if it was just sort of an extra experience thing or a direction thing. But usually when a main actor interacts with an extra who doesn't have words, the directions to that extra are very minimal. They're vague. They don't get told a lot. So she gets pushed past by him, and she spills the drink, and she does not acknowledge it. Like, she makes eye contact with the drink, sees it happen, and just keeps talking, just writes the drink and just keeps talking like it didn't happen. Which, it was probably a extra brain, like, let's not disrupt the shot and be chastised by the director for drawing attention away from the main actor, who's the main part of the frame. But it's just a very inhuman reaction. Just kind of amused me vaguely. Okay, tangent aside. Overall, like, there's a lot of things that are kind of fine, kind of good, not really extraordinary in this film. So now I want to I want to talk about, for a little bit of time, a couple of the, like, arcs and beats and things that should go somewhere that don't. Because that's really where, at least in retrospect, in thinking back upon it, where it starts to fall apart more, where things that I said, those were okay, the fact that they were unresolved, they were okay as they were coming out, but and with the context of the entire film, they are unresolved, and that bothers me more. So let's talk about it. And this is, again, going to have more comparisons to Goodfellas. Spoilers if you care. Minor spoilers. I'm not going to address things too directly. So one of the main arcs is we have our two main characters. They are twin brothers. They are presented as somewhat diametrically opposed, where Reggie, the quote-unquote sane one, is doing most of the work. He set most of the things up, and his brother Ron was, like, locked up in a psychiatric hospital, committed for, and then the only way he got out was because they threatened a doctor to basically get him out. And so he's presented up front as this, like, person who might just commit violence at any moment. And so that frames up a whole potential story of just, like, okay, if our main character is Reggie, is he going to start to regret this as this goes on? Is he going to have constant conflicts with his brother that lead him to believe that maybe he made a mistake letting him out? Maybe he's too much of a liability. maybe he's helpful and you love him, but he's too much of a problem, etc., etc. This gets played with a whole bunch throughout the film. And at the end, it does not come to a resolution at all, where they're basically, even though sort of one of the final lines in the film, one of the final like sort of parts of the climax of the film is them directly addressing the we are in massive conflict right now and I want to do something about it. And then they don't do anything about it. Like, it's never explored. You never see Reggie really struggle that much with the relationship that he has with Ron. They just sort of have a conflict and then they get over it. And at most, he, like, you could say, oh, it's his character. He's just stoic like that. He doesn't want to show those expressions. But we're the movie-going audience. We have the voyeuristic perspective of a movie-going audience. We have the opportunities to see him struggle in those moments by himself, to go, oh, do I have to change my mind about this? And nothing happens. They just sort of like, they feed off each other a little bit, but even that's not satisfying. It's not even, oh, it's the other way and Ron is corrupting Reggie to being a worse, more violent person or something like that. The arcs of both characters waver too much. And even though Ron is said to be like paranoid schizophrenic, they both have such swings of personality and motivation at random times throughout the film that's sort of one of the things that I said before started to make me think again, oh, wait a minute, are these not actually two different people? They're both so strange that they should probably be both diagnosed with maybe not the same thing, but definitely something. I mean, they're both sociopaths, clearly, but that's a separate issue. So it's just the random swings of behavior make for a confusing, uncompelling character and an arc of relationship exploration that does not conclude in any satisfying way. Then we have the relationship with Reggie's relationship with his love interest. There's no conflict there. You'd think at a glance that, you know, that'd be a very common trope of two brothers fighting over a woman, but that's not the case at all. And they make that very clear from the beginning and they don't go back on it. So that's not an issue. But the relationship that he has is never fleshed out in a meaningful way. Comparatively to Goodfellas, which, again, I have problems with that aspect of that Goodfellas story, is the relationship with the wife and women in general in the main character's life, because I don't think they're fleshed out that much. They're mostly there as sort of emotions to play off of, or to trigger certain behaviors or events. So rather, I don't really like them in Goodfellas all that much, but at least they are much more detailed. There's much more written into those relationships to help understand the dynamic between the two. Again, because of the random volatility of Reggie, and the sort of lack of any detail in his love interest, who I'm forgetting the name of because she's such a non-character. That is a very uncompelling story, other than the fact that you just sort of, as a person, generally most people would watch this and go, oh, I want her to be a good influence on him and for him to get better and want to be a better person and want to get out of crime. But that doesn't play out in any meaningful way. It doesn't even have an up and down arc. Like the one time that it seems to start to have an arc, it is within literally like minutes or even a matter of seconds, it is undone. And so that narrative is dulled at the very least. And because Emily Browning's character is the narrator as well, the whole framing of the movie is around her perspective and her misgivings about the behavior of her love interest. But she has no detail. She has no character detail. And other than just sort of a general melancholic feel to it, to say, I wish he had this, that, been better, whatever. It's not compelling. It's not interesting. It doesn't go anywhere. Even though it ends up being or being a source of major scenes, or seemingly major scenes. There's also no real exploration, very, very minimal exploration of the relationship between the Cray brothers and the rest of the underworld. There are several events throughout the movie, even slightly overarching ones, that include sort of their relationship to the other people within their circle and to other gangs and the police. And all of those could be very interesting things to explore. Plenty of movies that, do only that and do it to very interesting ways and meaningful ways. But they never explore the same as, the relationship with the wife and wanting him to get better. They never explore Reggie's interest in trying to get in further or out of crime. They never really explore that. They don't really, the other gangs and the police really only exist to act as set pieces and foils to their own personal attempts. And as soon as they are not plot relevant anymore, not like immediately currently plot relevant, they disappear from the screen, and they are not present in any of the like background narrative at all. They're really only there at the times they need to be to prompt certain scenes and events to happen. And so you get all these setups that, for all my misgivings of Goodfellas, are ultimately concluded in some meaningful way. All those arcs, all those mini arcs are ultimately concluded, even if I don't like how they're done. In this movie, none of them are really concluded. They mostly just sort of peter out, and none of them have any detail, any really soul to them, which is a shame, because I think in this movie, there is a good movie somewhere. A lot more needs to be shot. A lot of rewriting needs to be done. A lot more character exploration needs to happen. But there's something in this story. There are many things in this story. There's many different ways it could have gone that would have been more compelling individually. But ultimately, sort of none of them are. I will give it one thing that, like, it feels okay in its pacing. It is over 2 hours, and I was genuinely worried about that, given that it's not like a super well-regarded film. Usually something that runs sort of over that sort of time starts to play with being a little self-aggrandizing in its runtime and the scenes that it chooses to include. But for the most part, at least most of the scenes reasonably made sense to include. A few of them could have been cut out, but nothing would have gone gravely missing if they had cut this down to an hour and 45. But it at least didn't bore me, which frankly is something that on occasion, watching Goodfellas sometimes bores me. Sometimes it's a little bit too happy to hang around and monologue. But that doesn't make this a better film. I don't know. This is just, I wanted this to be better, and I almost thought that it was better than it is. But the more I think about it, and even now, the more I talk about it, the less appealing it is to me. So there's some reasonable things in here that I think are pretty good, and you wouldn't be totally wasting your time to watch it. But there's just too many films that are better, that are more entertaining, more engaging, have better performances and better writing. Anyway, thank you guys for watching another episode of Solipsist Watched. I've been your host, the Social Solipsist, and I'll see you guys next time.